We'll try as much as possible to finish everything today. Please, who is Emmanuel Atanyako? Are you the code official? Hello, Emmanuel Atanyako. Okay, just a second. Someone called me earlier. Let me know if it's the one. But someone is recording the meeting without my notice. So, I mean, that is not good. Need to see. All right, so let's continue. Yeah, so this week, please, can you see my screen?
No, please.
No,
Okay,
please.
let me adjust it again. Let me redo it again. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes,
all
sir.
right, all right. So today's lecture or today's session is a continuation of what we looked at last week. We looked at the concept of conflict analysis, and we looked at various concepts, who stakeholders are, methods of data collection, and then how to analyze the data and all that. So this week we'll be looking at some of the analytical tools that one can deploy when you have to undertake any form of analysis within a conflict situation, right? So we'll be looking at some of the various conflict analytical tools for today, right? So so for the first one, we'll be looking at conflict tree. So for this session, you should be able to identify the steps involved in the use of conflict tree tool in analyzing the causes and effects of a conflict, and then also identify some benefits of using the conflict tree tool in any conflict analysis. So we delve straight into it. So when we say conflict tree, just as the name sounds, a tree. So you picture or you imagine how a tree looks like, right? A tree has various components or various parts. So you have the stem, you have the leaves or the branches, and then you have the roots. So a tree has three major components or three major parts that comes together to make it what it is, right? So when we talk of the conflict tree as a tool to analyze conflict, basically we are looking at it from the perspective of how the tree, the parts of the tree looks like. So the conflict tree tool, we can say, is a tool that is used to analyze the conflict, right? And in doing this, we want to understand the various components of and dynamics of that conflict. We want to understand the various parts of that conflict to appreciate, I mean, why or what is driving that conflict, right? So the conflict tree specifically helps us to identify the causes of that given conflict, the drivers, what is fueling the conflict, and then the relationship among the various elements that is contributing to that conflict, right? So what are the root causes of that conflict, or what is the source of that conflict? What is driving that conflict, right? And then what are the effects of the conflict? So similar to a tree with roots, a stem and branches and leaves, the conflict tree too represent the multiple layers and interconnected factors that shape a conflict, right? So without the roots, without the roots, the tree will not survive, because then the tree cannot pick up nutrients from the soil, right? And without the stem, there will be no pathway for those nutrients to go through so that the tree can bear fruit. So just like that, you know, without uh, the sources or the root causes of any phenomenon, there wouldn't be any conflict. So if you want to understand a conflict, you need to look at it from this perspective. And as a conflict analyst, if there's any given conflict and you want to analyze, you may want to, use any one that you think is suitable for you to analyze that conflict, right? So the conflict tree in itself. So the conflict tree has some major components that we can use. So in analyzing the conflict, you need to make sure that you take on board these major components, because each major component has various underlying issues that is driving the conflict. So if you do not pay attention to one aspect of, that component, you might miss out on a lot of issues and dynamics that is at play, especially when it comes to that conflict. So with the conflict tree tool, we have the core problem. So one of the components of it is the core problem. So this represents the central issue or problem that is at the heart of the conflict. What is the core problem or the core issue that is bringing this conflict? So the core issue can be a chieftaincy dispute, right? The major thing that is driving this conflict is a chieftaincy dispute, right? It can also be a land dispute, right? So this is what the core problem is. Then within having that core problem, what are the causes that is driving, the conflict? So we can have the core problem, but we can have various dynamics that is contributing, or that is, keeping this conflict ongoing. So is it a structural issue or a social issue or economic or political, right? So for example, when we take the Boko conflict, even though the core problem here is probably chieftaincy disputes, right? We may also have other driving factors that is, keeping the conflict, uh, I mean, to exist, right? So the political angle, where political actors are behind the scenes also, fueling the conflict. So one party comes to power, and then one conflicting party, is being backed by the government or by political forces, and then when one party is also out of power and the other party comes, the other opposing, faction also stand to, benefit from, the perceived, ties with that particular, political authority or political powers. So those are some, issues that can also, keep the conflict ongoing, right? Economic, if it can be unemployment issues, it can be dispute over resources, right? Dispute over mineral resources within the community, where probably the government wants to lease a concession to so-called investors, and then the community is against it. The youth of the community are against it because, one, they feel that probably the royalties or whatever is not enough, so people begin to oppose it. So those are some underlying issues that can also keep the conflict ongoing. Then we also have to look at the effects, right? So just like the tree, the effects, we'll say the effect is the branches and then the fruits, right? The effect. So if the tree is in a location or is on a particular land where there is drought, there's no water to feed the roots that will probably carry nutrients into, the tree, and then so that it can bear some good fruit and all that. The effect is that the tree might eventually die off, or it might not bear fruit, right? So what are the effects of the conflict? What are the effects? Are the effects direct or indirect? So the direct effects can be that there will be loss of lives, destruction of properties, disruption in, our social life, where, for example, as a result of conflicts, curfews are imposed. People cannot go out at certain times of the day and in the night, right? All these have implications, because then if curfew begins at 4 p.m. and you have a business where maybe probably previously you used to close around 6, 7 p.m., as a result of the curfew, where maybe the curfew is between 8 and 4 p.m., 8 a.m. and then 4 p.m., it's going to negatively impact on your business. Then, people will suffer because you cannot operate at an optimal level. So it can also disrupt, our socioeconomic life. So this can be direct consequences, right? Indirect consequences, for example, can be that as a result of the conflict, you know, people people have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, or probably emotional and psychological, challenges. People have lost a lot of family members as a result of the conflict, right? So then when people are there, they begin to have some kind of, you know, playbacks and all this, and that might have effects on their mental health and all that. So those can be indirect consequences. And then also when you are using the conflict tree to, what you also have to pay attention to is that you have to look at the actors and then the stakeholders involved, right? Who are the individuals or groups, who are engaging within this conflict, right? So you have to look at that, the relationship between the actors and the stakeholders. What do the individuals want? Or what are their needs? What are their fears? What are the individuals saying they want, right? Because let's not forget that last week we mentioned that actors have interests. So any party within a conflict, everybody has an interest, right? So once you want to analyze the conflict, you need to look at the actors and the stakeholders who are involved. What are the interests of the actors, right? Then you can look at what both parties are saying. Party A says they want this, party B too says they want this. What can we do so that we bring both parties together so that there's some level of consensus, so that we can agree on one thing? And then also we need to look at the stakeholders who are involved in the conflict. Who are the stakeholders involved? Is it government, NGOs? So, for instance, government stakeholders, the National Peace Council, the National House of Chiefs. That is, if it's a chieftaincy dispute, we can look at stakeholders such as the National House of Chiefs and all those groups, right? What are their views and positions on the matter within the conflict, right? So the conflict tree too, all this makes up the parts of the conflict tree too. And then also we also need to look at the interactions and then the relationships among these groups. We need to look at the interactions and the relationships between the various actors and then the stakeholders. So if the relationship is not a positive one, the analysis will be able to bring out some of those findings that, well, both parties for a long time are not in a good relationship. The relationship between the two is always negative. So animosity towards each other. So if this party gets this one, they will want to kill. The other group will also want to kill, probably because of retaliatory attacks and all that kind of. So we need to understand the relationship that exists among these two groups, so that if the relationship is overly negative, we need to find a way of diffusing that kind of sentiments, so that both parties come together to be able to understand themselves. So that, because once the relationship is negative, I mean, they cannot interact positively. There will be no positive interaction, right? So we also need to pay attention to the interactions and the relationships that exist among the stakeholders and then the actors. So this is a visual presentation of the conflict tree too, where we have the three major parts. So we have the effects, which being the leaves and then the branches. We have the core problem, which is the stem, and then we have the causes, which is probably the root part of the tree. So beginning from the causes, which is the root part, what are the causes of the conflict? Is it inequalities, favoritism, corruption, chieftaincy disputes, exclusion from political participation or political power, manipulation of history? So for example, when you take the exclusion from political representation or power, during the 2020 elections, a constituency was not allowed to have or did not vote for political representation in parliament. The Sao constituency, right? They were denied representation in parliament. This can be a cause that can trigger and then lead to conflict, right? So those are the causes. Then the core problem. So the core problem is the main issue, a chieftaincy dispute. Is it a land dispute? Is it an ethnic tension between two ethnic groups? And then the effects are the outcomes, whether direct or indirect. So there can be killings, destruction of property, sexual violence, because during conflict, a lot of abuses go on and all that, right? So those are the effects when we are using the conflict tree to analyze a conflict. So this is a visual presentation of the conflict tree too, right? So in using the conflict tree to analyze the causes and effects of a conflict, there are some steps that you need to go through. That is, if you decide to use the conflict tree too. The first of it is that you need to identify the conflict, because you cannot just wake up and say you are going to analyze the conflict when you do not know what the conflict is about. So you need to identify the particular conflict you want to deal with. So the conflict, is a conflict an individual conflict? Is it a group conflict? Is it an ethnic conflict, tribal conflict, religious conflict? So you need to identify first the type of conflict you are going to be dealing with. Then the next thing you have to also note is that you need to identify the main issue at play. So determine the main issue or the problem that is at the root of the conflict. So is the main issue a land dispute? Is it a chieftaincy dispute? Is it tribal conflict or religious conflict? So having identified the main issue, then you move on to identify the causes. You identify the causes of the conflict. What is driving this religious conflict? Maybe Muslims and Christians. The Christians probably might say that, well, this is a Christian dominated community. And then the Muslims have come to invade our community. So we do not want them. They should go back to wherever they come from, right? So you identify the causes. So another example could be the Agogo Fulani conflict, right? Where the indigenes were of the view that the Fulanis do not hail from that community, but however, they brought their cattle to come and be destroying their farm and investments and all that. So that could be a cause of the conflict, right? Then the next step you have to do is that you need to group the various causes that is driving the conflict or underlining the conflict. So are the causes economic? Are they social factors? So if they are economic factors, what are the economic issues that is driving the conflict, right? So unemployment, you know, unemployment. A lot of the young people are not employed, despite for example, the existence of a mining company within their community, but they are not benefiting from the presence of that mining company within their community. So a lot of the youth will protest, and then this could degenerate into a conflict, right? There have been instances where some youths within some communities have invaded mining concessions and entered into concessions illegally, where there's been, some response from the mining company, which resulted in the death of some individuals, and this escalated, into a conflict where properties, excavators, and heavy, machinery were destroyed, and all that. So you need to also group the causes so that we'll be able to tell which ones are economic, which ones are social, which ones are um, cultural. So by cultural, we mean if it's religion, chieftaincy, and all those kind of issues that relates to culture, right? So you need to group those conflicts. Then you need to identify the effects. What are the effects of the conflict? So you need to identify all these effects. So are the effects on the individual level? What are the effects of the conflict? At the societal level, what are the conflicts on what are the effects of the conflict on the society, right? When a lot of social amenities and infrastructure is destroyed, it has a lot of impact on the society as a whole, right? So you need to identify the effects. What are the effects of this conflict? Then you need to also group the effects. You need to group the effects. Are the effects physical effects? Are they emotional effects? Are they social? Right. So you need to group the effects of the conflicts. You need to group them. Then you also need to analyze the relationship between the causes and then the effects. Right. Analyze the relationship between the causes and the effects. So which of these causes? So since you've already grouped because we've identified the causes and then group the causes, you also identify the effects and then you group the causes. So which of these causes are leading to these effects, right? And vice versa. So probably we have under the causes, we have economic causes, right? What are the effects of the economic causes, or what is the relationship of the economic causes? What are the effects of the economic causes? So, for example, if there is higher unemployment and lack of jobs, the effects could be that. So, the economic effects could be that. A lot of people now are engaging in social vices, right? So, armed robbery, prostitution, theft, and all those things. So, you need to analyze the relationship that, okay, well, we identify that these economic causes, they are leading to these economic effects on the society, right? So increase in social vices, armed robbery, theft, and all that. Then we need to prioritize the causes. Which of these causes is very important? And how relevant is it to the conflict? So if, even though the conflict is ongoing, and you identify that the major cause of the conflict is as a result of the chieftaincy dispute, then that chieftaincy dispute is leading to serious, effects on the society, right? There's no peace. So then we need to prioritize that chieftaincy dispute. Then we say, okay, even though there are so many causes of the conflict, the major one is the chieftaincy. Then, if in case of anything, we need to solve any problem or resolve any issue, then let's tackle the chieftaincy dispute or disagreement first, because that is what is leading to the major effects and all those things within the society. So you need to prioritize the cause. Then you identify the possible solutions that we can use to deal with the issue or resolve the issue, right? So when you want to use the conflict tree to do, these are the various steps or things you need to factor in when using the deploying the conflict tree tool in analyzing a given conflict. So then, what are the benefits of using the conflict tree tool? What are the benefits? So the first is that it helps us to understand the complexity of conflicts. So with the use of the conflict tree tool, you are able to break down the different factors that are contributing to the conflict. So when you take the causes, you're able to group the causes. So you know the various uh, issues that are contributing to the causes. So in doing that, it helps us to understand the complexity of what is driving this conflict. Then it also provides a comprehensive analysis in addressing. So in by this, we mean that we it helps us to address the important issues leading to effective and sustainable solutions. So, for example, we prioritize the most important causes or cause that is driving the conflict. So once we prioritize that, we are able to probably deal with the major problem that is driving the conflict. And once we're able to tackle the major issue that is driving the conflict, if even the conflict is not entirely resolved, the effects are drastically minimized, right? The effects are drastically minimized. So probably when a lot of people were dying as a result of the chieftaincy dispute, and then the chieftaincy dispute is resolved, I mean, the number of deaths and destruction of property that used to be the case will probably be minimized or eradicated, right? So that is one of the benefits. And then it also helps us to facilitate prioritization. So just like I mentioned, we prioritize the major issues so that we deal with those ones first before we can tackle the less minor ones. Because once the major issues are dealt with, the minor, there's no conflict. I mean, automatically or gradually, those other minor issues might go away or will be dealt with. So it helps us to, or it helps in facilitating prioritization. I mean, so that we can focus on the most critical issues to deal with. And then it also encourages collaboration, right? Collaboration. Then, because we are going to be dealing with actors and then stakeholders. So there's that kind of collaboration, interaction, right? Stakeholders and actors are able to interact. They can judge so that we see, I mean, the best way to deal with the situation. So in doing that, that's a form of collaboration. You bring two groups together so that they talk out their issues. So individuals, actors, stakeholders will say whatever they want to say, which is their interests and then their positions. And then we'll be able to come together to have some level of consensus so we can deal with the issue. And then also it supports the development of effective solutions, right? Yes, because we are able to identify the root causes of the conflict. We're able to identify the root causes of the conflict. We're able to identify the effects, right? We're able to group and prioritize the causes and then the significant effects. So in doing that, once you're able to prioritize the major causes and then the major effects, then I mean the solutions that will be brought will be major solutions. So in doing that, we are probably using the most effective way in dealing with the situation just because of the approach we use, prioritizing the most significant effects and then the causes of the conflict. So those are the benefits of using the conflict tree tool in analyzing any given conflict. So please, any question at this point? If you want clarity on anything, kindly let me know. Any question? Hello, any question?
No, sir.
Everything
Okay.
is clear.
All right. Okay, so we'll move to the next session, which is also another conflict analytical. So please, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, very well. So the next tool that we'll be looking at is the stakeholders conflict analysis. Stakeholders conflict analysis, right? So with this, we want you be able to explain the concept of stakeholders conflict analysis, and then some benefits of using the stakeholders conflict analysis in analyzing a given conflict. So the stakeholders conflict analysis is also another tool that we may deploy when we want to analyze a given conflict. So with the stakeholders, just like we talked about last week, so a stakeholder it can be individuals or groups, organizations that has an interest in a conflict. They have an interest in a conflict. So even though if the conflict might either affect them or not affect them, but they have an interest, right? So that is who a stakeholder is, right? So with the stakeholders conflict analysis, it's a process that involves identifying and assessing the key stakeholders in a conflict situation. So with this, we want to identify all the various stakeholders within a given conflict situation, right? Because one, the conflict might either be of interest to them or it might not be of interest to them. But we want to use that approach to analyze the conflict. So there are three different categories of conflict stakeholders, right? So we have the primary stakeholders, we have the secondary stakeholders, and then we also have the interested or shadow stakeholders. So who are the primary stakeholders? Primary stakeholders are basically individuals or parties that are directly involved in the conflict that affects them. The primary stakeholders are those who are directly involved within the conflict. So if you take any conflict situation, the primary stakeholders here will be those who are directly involved in the conflict. So for example, if we're using the Alavanyo Nkonya conflict, the people of Alavanyo and Nkonya are the primary stakeholders because the conflict affects them directly, right? So the effects, the killings, the destruction of property, it affects those people. So they become the primary stakeholders. And then the secondary stakeholders here we are saying these are innocent people who play no role in the conflict that affects them heavily. They play no role. So, for example of primary stakeholders, who do we use here, for example? So I'll use the Boko conflict in this case. So, during the, as the conflict has been ongoing, and then sometimes we hear of reprisal attacks and all that, and then sometimes we hear of, security forces being killed, immigration officers being killed, soldiers are being shot at, some police officers are being shot at, and all that, right? We have nurses who are to run away from hospital facilities and all that, just because of the way the conflict is moving, right? And sometimes some of these people become targets and they are shot and all that and killed and all that. So for those people, they are not involved in the conflict in any way. So for example, you have someone who is a police officer who has been sent from Accra to go and engage in some patrol duties within this conflicting community, and then that person is not even an indigene of any of the two communities, but he or she is killed, or it becomes a target and is killed. That person becomes a secondary stakeholder because they don't have any role in the conflict. They don't have any interest. They were just there to provide security, but they became targets and they were shot. So these are people we call, or we term, as secondary stakeholders. They don't have any role in the conflict, but it has affected them heavily, or they become affected by the situation, right? So these are who we term as secondary stakeholders. Then we have interested or shadow stakeholders. Interested or shadow stakeholders. So these are people or institutions that seek to benefit from a conflict. They may include mediators, security personnel, the government, political parties, etc. So many of them go to the extreme by investing in conflicts for profit. They often sponsor primary stakeholders for their own interests. Therefore, conflict experts describe them as conflict entrepreneurs. Right? So these are people who are behind the scenes and then sponsoring individuals who are the primary stakeholders. There's been some instance where it came up in the news, I think on Joy News some time ago, that the Boko conflicts. There are some people who are in Accra who are financing the conflict. So some people were interviewed, I think on Joy News. I've forgotten the news item, but some of these people within Accra who were engaged in Kayaye and other kind of jobs. Some people said they had to come and work, and then they repatriate the money back to their brothers there to be able to buy guns and ammunitions, right? So these people here, we term them as shadow, stakeholders, because they are financing the conflict, right? They are behind the scenes and financing the conflict, and probably their interest is that maybe they belong to one of the conflicting groups. So their interest is that at the end of the day, the person they are supporting should prevail, right? So they are behind the scenes, financing the conflict by providing, financial support so that people can buy guns and ammunitions, to engage in whatever is ongoing. So these are individuals we term as, primary stakeholders. Shadow stakeholders, right? When you go into, these global conflicts, most of these organizations that are into the manufacture of arms and ammunitions, most of them are financiers of this global conflict. So, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war, there are financiers behind it. So those who manufacture guns and ammunitions and bombs and all those things, they are benefiting from it. If there's no war, how do they, make money? So they are behind. There are some, I mean, experts who say that these are people who are directly benefiting from the conflict. So there's no way they will want this conflict to be resolved, right? So, that is who shadow stakeholders or interested, stakeholders are. So the process of using the stakeholders conflict analytical to analyze any given conflict. So if you want to deploy this particular tool, just like the conflict tree tool, there are some steps that you need to go through so that you'll be able to, analyze the conflict effectively. So the first thing you need to do is to identify the stakeholders. Identify the stakeholders. So this involves creating a list of all the individuals, groups, and organizations that have an interest in the conflict. So you identify all the various stakeholders who are engaged or involved in the conflict. Then you analyze their interests and concerns. So after identifying these stakeholders, what you need to do is that you need to note down their interests and concerns. Because don't forget, each and every stakeholder has an interest. They have a concern. So you need to note all these interests and concerns down, right? So this information, the essence of this information, taking down this information, is to help you to identify common areas, common areas and then areas of conflict, right? So maybe you have about 10 stakeholders. You've identified about 10 stakeholders within the conflict, and you've noted each and everyone's concerns and interests. After you note them down, you looked at it. Then after you look at it, you realize that maybe about 7 of these stakeholders are all saying the same thing. 3 are saying different things, but majority of them are saying that, well, we need jobs. So you identify these common themes or common thematic areas from the various stakeholders. And the essence of that is to help you to deal with the issue effectively. Once we know that, all the people are saying that they need jobs, majority of the people are saying that they need jobs, well, then the solution would be that we have to get them into some meaningful employment, if that will be a way of resolving the conflict, right? Then so be it. So identify their interests and concerns is very important to dealing with the conflict situation. Then you assess their influence and power. So this information is to help you identify the most important stakeholders and potential allies in the conflict resolution process. So you've listed or identified all the stakeholders engaged in the conflict. We need to look at their influence and power. Who has a lot of power among these groups of people you've identified? Who has a lot of power? If the government is there, if the government is a stakeholder in the conflict, then the government will have a lot of power. So you identify who is more influential and who is more powerful among the stakeholders. So that, this is to help you draw some kind of potential allies. So, for example, you want to bring together those who are more powerful, because once each stakeholder feels they are more powerful, there will be no consensus. Maybe the government will think, well, I'm the government, so I have more power, so you can't tell me what to do. So I'll do what I feel I want to do. Once there's that kind of assumption that someone has a lot of power, the tendency for it to derail the negotiation processes and the dialogue and all that thing is high. So you need to identify them. Then you need to bring them together so that each and every one will come down to the level of the least powerful. At least there'll be some kind of consensus, so that those who are more powerful will not use their power to override, or walk over those others that they feel are less powerful. Because once it is that way, there will be no consensus and there will always be conflict. Because then someone will feel, well, you think you are more powerful, so you want to walk over us, you want to bully us. Well, we will not agree. Do whatever you want to do. We'll also show you. That does not bring harmony and cohesion. So you have to be able to identify these various groups and the kind of power they wield. And then, having done that, then you develop strategies that you are going to use to engage these stakeholders, right? You need to develop strategies. So one of the ways of developing strategy is to build trust and cooperation, right? You need to share goals and interests. You need to create opportunities for dialogue and negotiation, right? So you need to bring the stakeholders together for dialogue and negotiation, so that each and every one will come to a point and agree that, well, let's all go this way. If this is the only way that will bring a resolution to the conflict, then we'll all abide by it. So that the influence of those who wield more power will not override those who are less powerful, right? Because that people feel they are being taken for granted because they feel someone is more powerful. There will be no negotiation and dialogue, right? So you need to also do that, develop those strategies so you can engage them and then bring about collaboration. So the benefits of using this approach is that it helps us to identify key stakeholders who are engaged or involved in the conflict, right? And then also it's good for assessing stakeholders' interests and concerns, right? Because with these two, you're able to identify what their interests are, what are their concerns, so that you'll be able to identify potential areas or common grounds and potential areas of conflict, so that if maybe you have about 7 of the out of 10 who are all saying the same thing, that this is what they want done, it is one way of resolving conflict. Then some level of consensus. Majority of the conflicting parties are saying they want this done. So it helps us to identify those areas of interest and concerns. And then the level of influence and power each and every stakeholder has. It helps us to be able to, draw them together so that they can negotiate and then dialogue, right? Yeah. So those are some of the benefits. And then it also helps us to build trust and cooperation. You've brought various diverse stakeholders together. So once you engage them, you speak to them, each and everyone is allowed to speak, make known their interests, make known their concerns. One way or the other, it's a way of building trust and cooperation, because through that there'll be some form of dialogue and negotiation, right? And then it also enhances effectiveness of conflict resolution strategies. Enhances the effectiveness of conflict resolution strategies, right? Because you are bringing different stakeholders together, you are taking on board their diverse interests and concerns, right? So everyone is allowed to speak at this point. Every stakeholder is allowed to speak. So once people are allowed to speak, they feel belong, or they feel a sense of belonging, where they don't come out to say that, well, we are not given the opportunity to share our view or share our concerns. So then we are not going to abide by these recommendations that probably the committee has brought. You know, once that is not done properly, I mean, the conflict cannot be. I mean, addressing the conflict will not be effective. So it's always important that, I mean, bringing together the stakeholders at the end of the day is going to enhance the effectiveness of the resolution strategy. Then, because everybody feels a sense of belonging, everybody feels that they've been heard, everybody feels that, I mean, their concerns has been addressed. So just like the Otunfo committee, the recommendations that came up, realized that one party came out to denounce and say that they are not going to abide by that because they were not heard. They were not heard, and all the kind of, I mean, issues they brought up. So once people feel belonged, at the end of the day, the strategies to address the conflict, it becomes effective because then there's no opposition to the conflict recommendations that has been made, right? So that is what the conflict stakeholder analytical tool is also about. Please, any question? Clarity? Okay, so then we move to the third tool, which is the needs fear mapping. Needs and fear mapping. So the needs fear mapping is also another tool that we may also deploy in analyzing any conflict, right? So this analytical tool is based on the idea that conflicts often arise when people feel their needs are not met, or when people feel that their fears have been unresolved, right? So then, if we want to address the conflict, then we will want to use this tool to, deal with this conflict. So, for example, during the conflict, someone's family, entire family has been killed, and the individual in question has reported the issue to the police. And for over 20 years, the case has not been resolved. The perpetrators have not been arrested. Nothing is being heard, right? So for such a person or for such a victim, he or she feels that, well, even my family members were killed 20 years ago. The issue has not been resolved. So then I'll also retaliate. And that has been the situation where sometimes you have retaliatory attacks, where people target individuals and kill them because they feel that, well, such an individual also perpetrated a crime against them, or maybe hurt a family member, killed a family member, or something. So once people feel that those issues have not been resolved, it can lead to conflict because then they'll also be tempted to also retaliate. You understand? Or people feel that their needs have not been met. So, well, people feel that, well, the government should do A, B, C, D, but the government has not been able to fulfill all those demands and all that. It can degenerate and then become a conflict then because they feel their needs have not been met. So the needs fear mapping is largely deployed in situations like this to be able to map the needs and the fears of the actors or the stakeholders who are involved in this conflict, so that we'll be able to address the underlying issues. Because once people have unresolved fears or unresolved issues, and the issue have not been resolved for so many years, the tendency that it can bring about the conflict again is high. Then one day you be there and you hear that, well, there will be some reprisal attacks. He or she has also gone to retaliate, to kill people, and to appease themselves and then feel okay. Right. So that is what the needs fear mapping is used for. We are mapping the needs and the fears of the individuals. Then we identify areas where we can resolve or deal with to address the conflict. So according to Fisher et al., the process of the needs fears mapping involves several steps. Right. The first step is that identifying the stakeholders. So just like the stakeholder conflict analytical tool, you identify the various stakeholders involved in the conflict. You map their needs. So what are the underlying needs of each stakeholder engaged in the conflict? Then you map their fears. You map fears. So fear of violence, marginalization, and what have you. So you map their fears. Or what are your fears? That is, keeping you still engaged in this conflict. So, well, my husband was killed, and the case has been reported, but up to date, the issue has not been resolved. No single arrest have been made. Right. So the need fear mapping will help you to map the needs and the fears of these people. Then having mapped these needs and the fears, it helps you to develop strategies to address all the issues that people have told you about. So you know what their needs are, you know what their fears are. So what then do we do? What strategies do we put in place to address all these issues so that we can, resolve the issue, the conflict once and for all? Right. So these strategies may involve the power imbalances, building trust and cooperation, or creating opportunities for dialogue and negotiation. Right. So dialogue and negotiation is very important. So the conflicting parties who are involved, you bring them together, you dialogue with them, you negotiate, so that people can make some compromises. Right. So you map their needs and fears. So that's what the needs fear mapping tool is about. Then what are the benefits of using this tool in analyzing a given conflict? So the first of it is that it helps us to identify the underlying causes of the conflict. Right. So and identifying the causes, what are the needs and what are the fears? Identify all these issues. Then it helps us to build empathy and understanding. So you give people the opportunity to talk. What are their fears? What are their needs? So it's a form of building empathy, empathizing with the people, giving them the opportunity to even talk. That's a form of empathy. Because when people feel that opportunities have not been given to them to tell their side of the story, to say what is worrying them, or to speak their challenges, it also kind of raises some level of suspicion, some form of distrust and all that, because people feel, well, they've not even given us the opportunity to come and say our side of the story. They are only listening to the other side, but they've not listened to us. So it doesn't build that kind of trust. So the needs fear mapping helps us to build that form of empathy and understanding. So you want to listen to the people's, own narration. You allow them to tell their story, what is really worrying them, right? So that's a form of building empathy and understanding. And then it also helps us to address power imbalances, right? So you identify the imbalances within the various stakeholders. So what are the needs of conflicting party A and conflicting party B, right? So if there's any power imbalance, so for example, the demands of one of the stakeholder groups is so much because they feel they are more powerful, so they want to make a lot of demands. But you see, that will not, result of then they are doing that because of, absolutely because of the power they wield, right? But with the needs fear mapping, once you able to bring them together and listen to both sides of the story, well, then as an expert or as an analyst, you'll be able to make a sound judgment that, well, even though, I mean, you are much more powerful than that, but sometimes we need to make some compromises so that we come down to the level of the others. Because once one particular group fails, the other group is trying to use their level of influence to make certain kind of outrageous demands. There will be no consensus, right? So with the needs fear mapping, it helps us to address that vacuum, that power imbalance, so that it brings some kind of a level playing field for everybody when they are doing the negotiations and then the dialogue. So at that level, everybody is the same. Someone doesn't feel the other group is much more powerful than the other and all that. So these are some of the benefits or the importance of the needs fear mapping. And then, of course, it helps us to facilitate dialogue and negotiation, because then you have brought the people together to the conversation table. So this person speaks, the other group also speaks. So there's dialogue. And then once that dialogue goes on, people negotiate. Okay, we want this, we want that, we want this. At the end of the day, you bring them together. Okay, well, these are what both of you are saying, that which is when it is done, you stop fighting. Okay, so then we'll do it for you so that the fighting can be. So it facilitates dialogue and then negotiation. And then it also enhances sustainability of peace building outcomes, right? Because once each and every party or each party feels that they've been given the opportunity to, tell their side of the story and what they want. At the end of the day, when there's an outcome, recommendation, both parties will agree to the outcome or the recommendations that is being made. So then one party will not come and say, well, we are not given the opportunity to also say our story. We are not heard. So whatever recommendation is being made, we will not abide by it. So the needs fear mapping brings that kind of, sustainability for peace building outcome. So at the end of the day, whatever recommendations that is made, both parties will abide by it. So these are some of the benefits of the needs fear mapping conflict analytical tool. Please, any question? All right. If no question, I will move to the next tool, which is the conflict mapping. Conflict mapping. So with the conflict mapping, it's a form or it's a way of, you are creating a map to highlight the various dimensions and components of a conflict. So you are mapping the conflict. You are mapping the conflict. So so for example, every given conflict has the causes and then the effects, right? So you want to map the various parts of the conflicts. What is this cause leading to? What are the causes? These causes, what are the effects? So in a nutshell, you are mapping the conflict. So here, the conflict mapping goes beyond the surface level manifestations and delve into the root causes, the actors involved, the relationships, and the contextual factors that shape the, the conflict, right? So similar to how a tree's branches and roots interconnect, conflict mapping helps us visualize the intricate web of factors that contribute to the escalation or perpetuation of conflict. So you'll be able to map out what are the issues, what is this issue leading to, and what is this particular issue also leading to. So you are mapping, it's like a web. You are establishing the linkages between one phenomenon to the other and then the outcome. That is what the conflict mapping is. And understand the various dimensions and dynamics of the conflict situation. It causes the actors and impacts of the conflict. Right. Now, what are the steps that you need to go through when you want to deploy the conflict mapping tool in analyzing a conflict? So the first of it is that you need to identify the actors. Identify the actors. Identify the issues. What are the issues that is driving the conflict? Who are the individuals? Who are the groups that are engaged in this conflict? So you need to identify all these issues. Then you also need to map the relationship between the actors involved in the conflict. So such as the alliances, the rivalries, and then the power dynamics. So you map the relationship. So mapping the relationship will help you to establish whether there's some kind of alliance between them, or I mean the relationship has always been one of a rivalry, right? So if you take the Boko conflict, the Kusasis and the Mampusis, and you are mapping the relationship, what would you say the relationship is? Are they rivalries? Were they once at a point in time, were they close allies? What happened that led to them being rivalries now and all that? So the conflict mapping will be able to bring out those kind of relationships, right? Then the next step you have to take is that you have to analyze the causes. Analyze the causes. What are the causes of the conflict? So is the cause an economic one? Is it a political one? Is it a cultural one? Or historical? So when you go into the history books, what has been the issue that has been driving the conflict over this period? Then you assess the impacts of the conflict, right? Assess the impacts of the conflict. So the impacts of the conflict, is it just purely economic, political, social? What are the impacts? So you assess all these impacts. Then you assess the impacts, right? So first of all, you identify the actors, you identify the issues, right? What are the concerns of the people? What are their interests? What are their positions? What are they saying they want? Then you map the relationship between the two. What is the relationship among the various stakeholders? Are they friends? Are they rivalries? You know, and then the power dynamics. Who is much more powerful among the various stakeholders? How can we bring them to the negotiation table to negotiate so that everybody will come to a consensus? Then you analyze the causes. What are the causes that is driving the conflict? And then the impacts of the conflict, right? That is a conflict mapping. So basically you are mapping the various dimensions of the conflict. you are mapping it so that you can be able to develop some strategies and interventions to deal with the conflicts. What are the benefits of the conflict mapping tool? So just like the other tools, it provides you with a comprehensive understanding of the conflict. It provides you with a comprehensive understanding of the conflict. And then it also helps us to identify the key stakeholders engaged in the conflict. Then helps us to identify the root causes. The root causes. So are the causes historical, economic, political, cultural. It helps us to identify all the underlying issues that are driving the conflict. Right. So identify the various causes. What strategies or avenues can we put in place so that we can resolve the conflict? So it helps us to identify areas where there are potential for dialogue and negotiation so that we can build trust and cooperation among the stakeholders so that we can resolve the conflict. So you bring the stakeholders together, you map the stakeholders, you bring them together, you identify, whatever their issues are. So at the end of the day, you'll be able to tell them, well, all the conflicting parties are saying that we should do A, B, C, D, right? And they've all agreed to it. So at the end of the day, the interventions that will be put in place is a consensus form of intervention. Then everyone agreed to that intervention. So, when that intervention is put in place, the tendency or the likelihood that another group will oppose it will be low because then, there's that kind of acceptance and then the rapport among them. So they all came to that conclusion that this is what they want to be done. So at the end of the day, there will be no form of backlash or opposition to the intervention that will be put in place. Then the final one is that it enhances the effectiveness of conflict resolution strategies, right? Because here, the effectiveness being that at the end of the day, all parties were given the opportunity to speak. They were given the opportunity to say or share their concerns. They were given the opportunity to negotiate, to dialogue, right? So once there's openness, there's dialogue, there's negotiation. It's very effective to deal with any given conflict, right? But in a situation where one dialogue and negotiation is not really open, people feel that, well, they were not given the opportunity to talk or speak their mind or share their views and things like that. It becomes problematic. So at the end of the day, it's difficult for them to accept any form of intervention or resolution that the committee or whatever authority that was set up to oversee the conflict the conflict is resolved, right? So it's very effective because at the end of the day, everyone was given the opportunity to participate. So it's an effective way of dealing with conflicts. Yeah. So I think that is all for the conflict mapping. That is it for the conflict mapping. And then also we have the mapping stakeholders relationship. Mapping stakeholders relationship. So we've looked at the stakeholder conflict analytical tool, right? But here we are looking at mapping. So just like the conflict mapping, here you want to map the relationship that exists among the stakeholders to be able to identify common areas or common grounds where all stakeholders are all speaking to a particular issue on how or what they feel needs to be done. so that the conflict can be dealt with effectively. So here, the mapping stakeholders relationship, we'll look at some of these issues. How, you need to map the relationship among the various stakeholders. Excuse me. So with a mapping stakeholders relationship, it's a tool that helps us to identify and understand the relationship between different stakeholders involved in a conflict situation. It helps us to identify and understand the relationship between diverse stakeholders who are involved in a conflict. So it is an important tool because it allows practitioners to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the power dynamics, alliances, and rivalries that exist between different stakeholders. So this tool helps us to understand and analyze the connections and dynamics between the various stakeholders involved in a particular context or project. So here, basically, the mapping stakeholders relationship, what basically we are doing is that we've identified the various stakeholders who are involved in the conflict. So what we are doing is that we are just mapping. So if you have about 5 stakeholders, so stakeholder number 1, you want to map his or her concerns against the other stakeholders. Then at the end, when you are done, you sit down to analyze among these 5, what are the particular issue they are all speaking to, or they are all saying is the situation. Right? So you are mapping whatever the various stakeholders are saying, so that at the end of the day, you can be able to develop some strategies and interventions to deal with the situation. Right. So that's what the mapping stakeholders relationship is about. So by mapping the relationships, we gain valuable insights into their interests, concerns, power dynamics, and potential areas of collaboration or conflict. So with the mapping stakeholder, it helps us to, gain insights into the various interests of all the various stakeholders. What are their concerns? What are their interests? What are their positions? So you want to map all these issues against all the various stakeholders. So similar to the conflict trade framework, it helps us to understand the conflicts, mapping stakeholders' relationships. It provides us with a structured approach to comprehend the complex web of interactions and dependencies between the various stakeholders. Right. So every stakeholder has their concern. They all have their position. They all have their interests. So then you are going to map it out to see what are the various issues each and every stakeholder is saying about the conflicts. Then based on all those issues they've told you, you'll be able to map out and identify common grounds, common areas, common thematic areas that probably should be taken note of seriously, so that when that particular issue is addressed, the conflict can be resolved. Right. So the mapping stakeholders relationship, it helps us to navigate through diverse perspectives, interests, and goals, which can significantly impact the success or failure of initiatives. Right. So just like the other conflict tools, with this also, when you want to use it, there are some steps that you need to go through when you want to deploy and use this tool in analyzing your conflict. The first is that you need to identify the stakeholders. So just as the name of the tool sounds, mapping stakeholders, you need to identify the stakeholders. So you create a list of all the individuals and groups and organizations that are involved or affected by the conflict. Then the next thing you do is that you map the relationships among the various stakeholders. So you identify the relationships between the stakeholders among the involved in the conflict. So you identify those who are rivalries, those who are, the alliances and power dynamics, and the degree of influence of each stakeholder. So the power, you look at the power each stakeholder has. How powerful is this stakeholder in the conflict, and how is that power, or how can that power they wield influence the negotiation process or the dialogue? So once you map all these issues, you'll be able to tell which of them among the stakeholders has a lot of power. And if one person has a lot of power, what can we do so that, the power of that person will not overshadow that of the other stakeholders? So that at the end of the day, the views, the views and then the negotiations of the most powerful one will not be imposed on the less powerful stakeholder. Because at the end of the day, we want peace to prevail. So we don't want a situation where one group will not feel belong, or they will not feel that, the views of the most powerful one is being imposed on them, right? So you map the relationship, and in mapping the relationship, all these issues will come up so that we can know where to negotiate properly, so that each and every one comes on board and is okay with whatever recommendations or interventions that will come at the end of the day. Then the next step we'll have to do is that we need to analyze the relationships. Analyze the relationships. So this involves the analyzing the relationship between different stakeholders to understand the underlying reasons for this relationship, such as their shared interests, values, or goals. So in analyzing the relationship, you want to identify whether all the stakeholders are sharing a common interest, or they have a common goal, right? So the interests or goals here could be that, well, at the end of the day, they all want peace. They all want peace. So that becomes a common goal, a common interest for all the stakeholders. So if they all want peace, then what can be done to ensure that there is peace? Right. So in analyzing the relationship, this is where all these issues will come up. Because once this comes up, then we'll be able to propose or identify areas where can be strengthened or can be worked on, so that there is peace at the end of the day. Right. Then it also helps to identify opportunities for collaboration. It also helps to identify opportunities for collaboration. So with the stakeholders mapping, you are mapping the relationship and all the issues among the various stakeholders. So it's in doing that, we might be able to identify some areas of collaboration where each stakeholders can be brought together to work together, right? So if at the end of the day they share a common goal, a common interest, then collaborating or collaboration will not be a problem. Because if at the end of the day they all want one thing to be done, then it means we are all fighting towards, making peace. So then we'll be able to bring all of them together to ensure that that peace is achieved. So the common goals and relationships that exist among them will determine whether they will be able to collaborate to ensure that peace. So if at the end of the day, the stakeholders do not share a common goal, a common interest, each and every one has their own interests and goals, then we cannot collaborate, because then there's no consensus on what we want to achieve regarding the conflict. So there can be no way they will want to collaborate with each other, right? But The opposite is that if they share a common goal and interest, then at the end of the day, it helps us to, I mean, or create opportunities where all these stakeholders can collaborate to ensure that there is peace at the end of the day. So this is what a mapping stakeholders is about. These are the various steps that one will have to go through, or these are the steps that you need to take notes when you want to analyze a conflict using this particular tool. So this is a visual representation of the mapping stakeholders relationship, right? So over here we have the government, we have the army, rebel group, trade unions, opposition party. So you see that between trade unions and opposition party, then there's an alliance. So the alliance is a very straight line. So there's an alliance. So alliance here means that, you know, so they'll always be fighting the government, right? So they'll fight the government in terms of maybe, for example, um, GPRTU. Now there's a session that fuel prices of fuel is coming down all the time. Has come down drastically. So drivers will have to reduce, you know, their transport fares. So the government is always advocating that, well, fuel prices are down, the city is stable, dollar is down, and all that. So that must reflect in your pricing. But some of these people will say, well, the uncertainty in the dollar is it's not helping our business because today it is fluctuating, so we can't tell. Moreover, people bring their words, and then there's no price control and all that, and so usually the relationship between the government and some of these unions is not really a very good relationship, because some of these unions will be fighting for increments in salaries, increments in allowances, and all that. So sometimes you see them going on strike, they go on strike and all that. But the relationship between trade unions and opposition party is always a perfect one, because whatever the trade unions and organizations are fighting for, and of course they are fighting the government. Opposition always look after some of these things, political benefits, right? They feel that once some of these unions are going on strike and all that, it makes the government unpopular, and then they'll have that kind of political capital. They'll benefit that kind of political capital out of that, and then they can win power. So you always find that sometimes opposition party will always come and be speaking for the trade unions, whereas for the government will say, well, we don't have money. We didn't budget for this in the budget, so maybe next year we'll increase your salaries and all that. So a classical example is the time when nurses went on strike. I think somewhere last year, when nurses went on strike, where they demanded some form of allowances and all that, and this was all over the news. The opposition was speaking. Became more of like a spokesperson for the trade. This group, but they say, yeah, government needs to pay these people. These people are working; they deserve it, and all that. So they need to be paid and all that. So you could see that the opposition and these groups, they are singing one song. However, when the government and the opposition party, you see, there's that kind of broken relationship, because always the opposition party will always be accusing the government of something. Just they want to do something just to make the government unpopular. right? So that relationship there is not, it's a broken relationship. It's not really an alliance because they always oppose whatever the government will do. Even now that fuel is down and the dollar is stable, the city is stable and all that, opposition will always want to find a way to, make the government unpopular and say that, well, fuel is down, but, the prices of fuel at the international market is down. So this one is no news and things like that, right? Opposition always want to oppose anything the government does. However, we will see that between the government and the army, there's an alliance because, of course, the army is an extension of the government, and the army and the security services are supposed to ensure peace and stability. And of course, they're an extension of the government. So definitely you will see that there's some form of alliance, right? However, when it comes to the rebel groups, it's a conflict, a relationship because you do not expect rebel groups like Boko Haram and things to be in an alliance with the government because these are designated like terrorist organizations that are destroying infrastructure, killing people and all that. So there's that kind of conflict relationship among them. So you always find that the government will have to deploy the military to go and counter these groups and all that. So this is how the mapping stakeholders relationship more or less looks like. So you want to establish the relationship that exists among these various stakeholders. So who are those who have the alliance? Who are those who have the relationship is not that smooth, it's a broken relationship because sometimes trade unions they can go demonstrations and become violent and all that and destroy property and all that. So sometimes we can see some semblance of linkage between these groups, right? So this is how the stakeholders mapping stakeholders relationship looks like visually, right? So what is the benefit of of this of this tool? The benefit is that it provides a comprehensive understanding of the conflict. So it helps us to identify the different stakeholders who are involved in the conflict situation and the relationship that exists among each and every one of them. So, and then also it helps to identify the power dynamics. The power dynamics. What is the relationship when it comes to the power that exists among this group? So this is important because it can help us to understand who has influence over others and why. So just like I showed you in the representation in the diagram, you will see that when it comes to the government and the army, there's that kind of relationship because the government controls the army, right? The army is there to maintain peace and stability and all that, and including the security forces. So the government has power over the army. The relationship that exists between the opposition and the other groups. So these two helps us to identify who has power over who controls what and who does what, right? And then also it helps us to identify opportunities for collaboration. So where we can collaborate. So maybe the government and then the trade unions and organizations. So that they can collaborate because so that there's that kind of peace and harmony, right? So that workers do not go on strike. And when they go on strike, we know the ramifications of nurses and doctors not going on strike and all that. So once we identify that the relationship between these groups and the government is not an alliance or a perfect one, then we should be able to identify what can the government do to ensure that there's that kind of harmony and collaboration among it and then these other groups, so that there's peace and stability, right? So these are some of the benefits of the mapping stakeholders too. And then it also enhances the effectiveness of conflict resolution strategies, because then we've been able to identify the power relations among these various groups. So at the end of the day, if you want to bring some strategies or interventions to address the conflict, you'll be able to tell who you can talk to and then who you can go to, who you should be able to convince more, so that they buy into what you are saying, right? So, I mean, if the trade unions will want the government to do what they are demanding, then they will have to go to the table, sit down, negotiate, so that whatever issue that is there, the issue can be resolved properly, right? So, I mean, it enhances that form of effectiveness when it comes to conflict resolution. And then also it promotes inclusivity and participation. Inclusivity and participation. This is because, I mean, all the stakeholders who are involved are participating in the process. You are able to map out and then talk to all these various groups. And once people feel included in something, they participate. I mean, at the end of the day, whatever intervention and strategy that is put out or recommendation that comes up, each party will accept it. I mean, hopefully. But if one party do not feel included in the process or they don't participate, once some recommendation is made, they'll kick against it, and then the conflict will still go on. So the mapping stakeholders relationship tool promotes that form of inclusivity and participation, because then everyone is given the opportunity to, to speak, to share their interests, share their concerns and all that, right? So that is how it promotes inclusivity and then participation. Then finally, please, any question at this point? Okay. Finally, please, I see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the final bit of it is data collection for conflict analysis. So last week we looked at that. We looked at the various ways of collecting data when you want to analyze the conflict. So we talked about the interviews, the surveys, the focus group discussions, you know, these are ways of collecting data. You can do a review, a desk review. So you sit on your computer, connect to the internet, you look for empirical literature, you do your research to see what people have written about, a particular conflict. So all these are strategies that you can deploy when you want to collect data in case you want to analyze any conflict. So we spoke about it, but I'll just react to it because more like repetition. There are various methods that can be used for collecting data in conflict analysis. So the first point is desk research or desk review, right? So this involves reviewing existing literature, reports, and other relevant documents related to the conflict. This can provide valuable background information and insights into the conflict. So this review, like I mentioned, you go like conflict. you get a lot of information on the internet, what people have written about it, right? Then you read about it to understand the genesis of the conflict, the actors, how has the issue traveled all over this year. So you get all those resources on the internet, right? You can even get, in terms of uh, judicial rulings and all that, you get all of those things on the internet. So that's more like a desk research or desk review. You sit at the comfort of your home and your computer, and then you research about the conflict. So that's a way of getting insights or information about the conflict you want to go analyze or you want to go and gather data on. And then another method is interviews, right? So interviews with key stakeholders can provide first-hand information about the experiences, perceptions, and motivations related to the conflict, right? So you talk to people. So you can talk to community elders and chiefs within the affected area. You can talk to individuals within the community just to get their opinions and insights on the conflict. You can speak to experts, maybe people who are work on in the conflict, that conflict area over a certain period of time. So interview. So interview here means you speak to them. So it can be telephone. You speak to them via telephone, which is known as a telephone interview, or you get your tape audio recorder. You go to the community. You speak to the chiefs. You speak to elders. You speak to individuals. So that is a way of collecting data from as part of your conflict analysis procedure. Then we also have what we call a focus group discussion. I wouldn't want to go to that. That is more like a research methods. But with focus group discussion, what you do is that you bring people together. So, for instance, you go to the community, you bring together opinion leaders, community leaders. So maybe 6 or more people. You all sit down together, and then you ask the question, and then each and every one will take a bite on the question. They'll respond. So maybe once you pose a question, and then maybe the assemblyman will respond. Then maybe a unit committee member will also respond to that same question, right? So that's what we call a focus group discussion. The essence of the focus group discussion is to get diverse perspectives in relation to the conflict. So the same question you ask all of them, but you realize at the end of the day, each and every member really, right? So the focus group will help you to get all these diverse perspectives from all the people you are interviewing within the focus group. And then we also have what we call the service. So the service here is design a questionnaire on a paper. You take it and give it to people for them to fill it for you, or you ask them. You'll be reading the question for them and you'll be filling it for them, whichever means you want to do it. Or it can be online. So you deploy the survey online. So you develop the questions and then you send it to people. You send it to people via WhatsApp groups that, oh, please, I'm conducting a research on so and so and so. Kindly take some few minutes to, fill these questions for me, respond to these questions for me. So that's an online survey. That's an online survey, right? So there are various approaches you may want to use. And then we have what we call the observation. So the observation, you go into the community, you go and sit somewhere and you'll be observing. You want to get first-hand information by yourself. You don't want to talk to anybody because people can give you biased information. So sometimes what you can do is that you will go and sit somewhere and you'll be observing. You'll be observing people, what's the routine of people, what is going on, right? Then you take notes. You take notes down. You observe, you come and take note down. Then at the end of the day, you analyze that report, those notes you took. You analyze it. You analyze. So that is what we call observation. Right? So it's also another technique you can use in collecting data. And what are the benefits of taking data? The importance of data collection for analyzing a conflict. So it provides a comprehensive understanding of the diverse source of information so that you can analyze, right? Because if you don't talk to people, how do you get information? If you do not do research, desk research or desk review, how do you get information? So the data you collect about the conflict is a form of information that you can use and analyze. Then you can draw your recommendations and then make some interventions and all that. So the data gives you a comprehensive understanding of the conflict, right? So for example, if I want to analyze the Boko conflict analysis, if I look at the output of people, probably people who know the conflict very well, people who know the genesis of the conflict, I'll talk to them and get information from them, and then I'll come and analyze the information, decision making. Because whatever decision you're going to make is based on data. It's based on data from the field, from the conflict zone, right? So that is evidence based. Because if you take the data, you have conducted a survey, and the data is showing that the um, I mean, one of the ways of dealing with a conflict is that maybe we need to institute some curfew hours, or I don't know, whatever your findings will say. Then it means that at the end of the day, the interventions and the recommendations you are going to make is going to be evidence based because it's based on data, right? And then it also helps us to identify opportunities for intervention. So you've spoken to people, people have shared their experiences with you and all that. Then you come and sit down, analyze that data, then realize that, well, as a result of the conflict, a lot of people are struggling. There are no jobs, there are no hospitals, schools are closed down and all that. What can we do to address some of these issues? So once your data shows that, well, people know, as a result of the conflict, people can't even go to, there are no health facilities around because they're all destroyed. Maybe then one of your recommendations will be that, well, the government should probably take steps to probably, put up some health infrastructure, put up schools and all those things so that people can have access to some of these things. So, I mean, those are some of the benefits. So, opportunities for intervention. And then it also promotes inclusivity and participation because you are conducting interviews, you speak to people, you are conducting focus group, you talk to people, right? So the surveys, interviews, and focus group, all these things you are talking to people. So the people become a part of the whole process. They become a part of the whole process. So they feel a sense of belonging and participation. So in itself, that data collection approach in itself promotes that form of inclusivity, right? And then it also enables monitoring and evaluation, right? Monitoring and evaluation being that um, once the data points you to certain areas, you want to, from time to time, you want to monitor and evaluate whether the interventions you put in place. So we put up schools, and that is done. From time to time, we need to monitor and evaluate and see what is the impact of those maybe institutions were not there or facilities were not there. A lot of people were dying from maybe some cholera and things like that, right? But how do you put up that facility? So from time to time, you go and monitor to assess the impacts, to assess the impact of that intervention that has been put in place. So data collection or data is very important when it comes to conflict analysis, right? So, I mean, that is it regarding uh, data collection when it comes to conflict analysis, right? So, I mean, this is the end of the presentation. At this point, I want to know if anybody has a question or a concern, you might do something. Please kindly draw my attention. Please, any question? Hello, any question?
No, sir.
All right, so hello, Geoffrey, did you want to ask a question?
No, sir.
All right. So very well. So thank you for your time. I wish you the best for the rest of the day. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Mm.